The vehicle we're working on today is a 2010 Chevy Malibu, and it's got a noise in the front end. I don't know if you'll be able to see this on camera, but this bearing, I'm wiggling the whole car, the bearing's loose. It's making a lot of noise. There's a couple different ways to diagnose these. Obviously the easiest one is if you bring the car up on the lift or up on a jack, wiggle the tire back and forth, up and down. One thing you got to watch out for is sometimes side-to-side play can often be a loose tie rod, inner or outer, or a ball joint. So you really got to look to make sure it's your bearing that's actually loose. Another way to do it.
Dad, I found a snake.
Another way that you found a snake, huh? Cool. Another way to do it is to put someone in the car, turn off the traction control, and have them put the car in gear and run it up to about 40 or 50 miles an hour. And very carefully on the back side, on the inside, put a pry bar or a stethoscope with a steel end on it up against each steering knuckle. Don't touch moving parts, obviously, and you'll be able to hear which one's making more noise. I didn't do that in this case because I can feel the play in this bearing, and I know that this bearing is bad. So let's go ahead and get started. First, we're going to take off the caps on the hubcap. The lug nut. Three-quarter inch or 19 millimeter on the lug nuts. The center nut here on the axle is actually a 35 millimeter. I know a lot of guys don't have a 35. They go from 34 to 36. A lot of the kits do. A 36 will work just fine. When you're getting into something this big, 1 millimeter isn't going to make you strip the nut off. I do have a 35 though. But I'm going to leave that tight and I'll show you why. I'm going to create just a little bit of play here in the brake so that I can slide the caliper off the rotor and slide it back on easily. We don't have to take the caliper off of the bracket because we're not servicing the brakes. We can remove it as an assembly and hang it up out of the way. The bolts that secure the caliper bracket to the steering knuckle are 15 millimeter. Slide the rotor off out of the way. Just take a coat hanger or a piece of mechanics wire and tie the caliper up to the spring to hang it out of the way. And the bolts that actually secure the hub assembly into the knuckle are 13 millimeter on the back side. Some of those are kind of tight to get at. So I'm going to grab a wrench. And there's 3 of them. As you'll notice, I left the steering unlocked on the car. And the reason I do that is it makes it easier to get the bolts out, especially the top bolt. Sometimes they won't come out, especially on a vehicle with a bigger axle. If you can't get in there to get the bolt out, at least enough to get the hub assembly off, just loosen the nut up on the axle and push the axle in. A lot of times you can push it in and it'll stay pushed back just far enough to create a void so you can get the bolts out. In this case, they come right out, so it's not an issue. Okay, there's the third one. Real quickly here. This particular model has ABS. And this, well, let me see if I can get you in the photo here. And this is the wiring connector for the ABS. Just push down on that tab. Push down on that tab and it slides right out. Pinch the little keepers here, the wire keeper in. Pinch those two together with a pair of needle nose pliers and that'll fall right out of place. Okay, we're ready to get this bearing loose. Now if you recall, I left this nut on, I left it tight, and I told you there was a reason for that, and the reason is I'm not going to use a slide hammer today on this particular bearing. I'm going to hit it, I'm going to strike it with a hammer right here and right here. And by leaving that nut on the axle and leaving it tight, it holds the bearing together and it'll separate the whole bearing from the steering knuckle. Oftentimes I'll run into situations where the bearing's really worn or really loose, and if you take that nut off and you start beating on this right here, you're going to separate the bearing, and then you're going to have a little bit of a more difficult time getting the backside of the hub assembly out of the steering knuckle. So I'm going to leave that together until I get everything loose, and then I'll take the nut off and drive the axle out of the spindle here, and everything will come apart. Okay, it's loose. And I knocked my caliper down. That happens. Okay, the bearing is loose. It's ready to come out. I'm going to take that nut off. Like I said, that's a 34 millimeter on this particular car. Or correction, I'm sorry, 35 millimeter. But as I stated before, a lot of the sets don't come to 35. If you buy the axle nut socket set, they go from a 34 to a 36, and a 36 will work fine. When you're dealing with something this big, 1 millimeter is not going to cause that nut to round off. Okay. For somebody who hasn't done this before, take note of how this splash guard sits in there, because when you put it back together, if you put it back together wrong, you're going to be hating yourself when you go to put the brake caliper on it. Push that axle in a little bit, you're able to get that wire right out of there. So I'm going to straighten that out where I bent it and clean this up, and I'll go grab the new bearing and put it back together. Okay, I got the area all cleaned up, and as you can see, I applied anti-seize. I get made fun of sometimes by my fellow mechanic friends that I'm wasting time, and I really don't see it as a waste of time. If you've got a repeat customer and you put anti-seize on there, maybe 2, 3, 4 years from now, I'm going to pull this bearing off again to replace it. It's going to come off a lot easier because I did that than if I had just thrown it together without cleaning up the area or putting anti-seize on it. I use the gray stuff. Everybody has their own preference, that's mine. So let's go ahead and put this new bearing back on. The brand of bearing I went with is a Napa brand bearing. I did notice that this bearing was replaced once before. Be careful to get the wire that you don't pinch it in there. The bearing was replaced once before, and you can see they struggled to get it out because they must have used a chisel, and I'm guilty of it. I've done it in the past. When they separated the bearing from the steering knuckle, they cut the shield in half here, and then you could see right where this goes. There's a little bit of an indent there. I noticed that when I was cleaning it up, but not a big deal. And like I said, I'm guilty of the same thing. Okay, we'll get her up into place, and we'll get the bolt started from the back side. Make sure my wire's coming through here without getting pinched. All right. Don't ever start these with an impact or even an air ratchet. Always take the time to start these by hand. You're just asking for trouble. Okay, I got all three of them started. I'm going to use my air ratchet to run them in. I've been using this same Ingersoll Rand air ratchet since, well, it's been about 15, 16 years now. I should do a review on it. This thing's awesome. I don't even know if you can get them anymore. I've seen some used ones on eBay, but... Alright, I'm going to go ahead and plug in my electrical. Make sure it snaps into the little bracket that holds it up here. If your bracket's broke or for whatever reason you can't get that electrical wire to snap into place, at least throw a zip tie on it or something to keep it away from the axle, because if it starts rubbing on the axle, you're going to wear a hole in it and you're going to get an ABS light, your traction control is going to quit. Okay, the bearing's on. I'm going to put the nut on. Like I said, this is a Napa brand bearing. A lot of the places, a lot of the aftermarket places that sell parts will actually give you a spec as far as the axle nut torque. So it may differ from manufacturer. This particular one's 180 foot-pounds, and I think a reason why they do it, a lot of them do it, is because they don't want guys running this down with a gun and calling it good enough and then replacing their bearing while it's still under warranty multiple times. So take the time to do it right. You won't have to do it twice. I've got my torque wrench set to 180 foot-pounds. Set my pry bar in here. Okay, it's torqued. Alright, I'm going to turn the wheel back to the right. Make sure that our dust shield is pushed out of the way so that it doesn't make contact with the rotor. We're going to go ahead and put the brakes back on, put the wheel on, and take it for a drive. push the brake pads back into their place if they move. Always, always, always start those by hand. Don't run them in with the gun. Well, you can run them in with the gun. Don't start them with the gun. Again, those were 15 millimeter. One more thing I'd like to add is when you get the vehicle back on the ground and you're going to back it out, before you even put it into reverse, pump the brakes a couple times, because I did push the piston back in this caliper to make enough room to easily put the caliper and bracket back onto the rotor. So pump the brakes a couple times and you'll be all set. I'm going to put the tire wheel back on, put the hubcap on, lower it down, and take it for a test drive. I hope this video was informative to somebody, and if it was, don't be afraid to give me a like. Hit the subscribe button. I got more videos coming. Thanks for watching.